And I think hope this paper will be quite an interesting flip side to the fascinating work that Jenny and Zhang have just shared, which is thinking about how to deal with AI in a pedagogically informative and reflective way. We're thinking in what I'm going to be presenting about the very blunt force uses of AI and what happens when students or AI tools are used to just copy and paste an answer into an essay question. So just by way of quick introduction, so I'm Alistair Brown. I'm Associate Professor of Digital Humanities and Modern Literature at Durham University's Department of English Studies. I'm representing here work done in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Tom Marshall, who was formerly a teaching fellow with us. Unfortunately, due to academic precarity, he's no longer part of our institution, but his role in this project is every bit as fundamental. So I'm speaking with two different voices here. So in brief, what we were doing in this project is thinking about the ways in which AI responds with some quite interesting and subtle variety to different types of exam-style essay questions that we usually ask in our subject area of English. Although we're focused on English, I think actually what we've got to say will probably translate to other disciplinary contexts as well. So before we get to the AI stuff, it's important to remind ourselves just how subtle question design can be. And especially in the essay form, sometimes quite trivial changes in the way the essay question is constructed can motivate very different types of response. So what you can hopefully see on screen here, you can see my slides. I take it before I go further.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. So what you can hopefully see on screen here is 4 examples of basically the same topic being addressed, a question about proprietary and passion in 19th century fiction, but framed in quite different ways. So this first question includes a quotation about proprietary and passion, quite a controversial quotation, and it asks the student to what extent we agree with this statement in relation to 2 Jane Austen novels. The second question is a little bit more of an open question. It's an invitation to discuss that significance, but it doesn't presuppose an answer one way or the other. The third question is more open still, because you're no longer limited to Jane Austen's corpus. You can talk about novels of the Romantic period generally, and that might mean that whichever texts you choose will motivate a different type of response to that problem. And then the fourth, this and/or question, discuss proprietary and/or passion, can be more or less open depending on how you deal with that and/or. So if you deal with it as an and question, discuss proprietary and passion, it's very similar to question 2. If you focus it as an or question, maybe you just discuss proprietary in ways that aren't connected to romantic love and connected to passion in these novels. Okay, so we've got 4 similar topics, 4 seemingly similar questions, but there are 4 very distinctive types of approach that each of these questions is designed to elicit. So building on that kind of tradition, what we were thinking about was how making small tweaks to question wording might create different outcomes in terms of AI outputs, and how generative AI, specifically ChatGPT 4, which was the newest model at the time we did this original study, might respond differently to those nuanced variations in a question. And by understanding that, what we hope to do was provide a modest buffer against AI in 2 different ways. So firstly, might it be that certain forms of question wording tend to lead to demonstrably weaker forms of AI output? And if so, that might mean that work would naturally be scored lower, so that even if you haven't identified that a student has used AI, there's a kind of inbuilt penalty effect when AI is used to respond to that particular type of question. And secondly, we were thinking, well, what if certain types of question lead to more obvious AI fingerprints? So perhaps AI might deal in really obviously AI-like ways when you have a quotation in a question versus if you don't have a quotation in a question. And that might be a kind of way of developing a heuristic to identify where AI use has been done. So those are the problems that we set ourselves. I'll just walk you very briefly through the methodology, and then we'll get to the kind of findings and some recommendations for question design itself. So our first challenge was to build a kind of taxonomy of question types. That's actually quite difficult because, as the previous slide exemplified, you can have seemingly similar question structures can actually elicit very different types of response. But we eventually came up with a rough taxonomy of question types that broadly moved from being more closed type questions to more open type questions. So, for example, a question that let's see if I can get the pointer. A question that includes a quotation that asks us to answer on a particular author and it doesn't have any and/or optionality in it. That's quite a closed question. A question that doesn't have a stimulating quotation, that doesn't require you to answer on one particular author or text, and that has and/or optionality built in, that's a much more open type of question. So having built this rough taxonomy, we then chose a representative exam question of the sort that's usually asked in our subject areas for each of these 6 categories. And these were from modules that we were quite familiar with as markers, so we could do some inductive reading as well as just quantitative analysis. What we did then was input each of these 6 questions into ChatGPT 4, surrounded by a very standard wrapper text. So we told ChatGPT, write a word count, so it's usually a 1200 word essay, write a 1200 word essay on the following question, and then we just pasted the question blindly in there. If a question invited students to write on any applicable text rather than a named text or author, we then told ChatGPT what the topics and the texts it could choose from might be. Now, obviously, what we're not doing here is replicating real-world student behavior. Okay, so even a very lazy AI student user would obviously do some sort of prompt engineering. They tailor the question, they adjust the output of AI in a manual way after they've received it. But our aim wasn't to think about what students are actually doing. It was to use tweaks in question design to prise open that black box to understand at a basic level what AI does when it reads a question. We then ran each of these prompts 15 times per question. That gives us an average data set. It irons out idiosyncrasies between different types of output. We obviously did some basic data cleaning, tokenized it, and so on. And then we put our 90 initial results through a bunch of standard computational analytics. So, sentence length, number of paragraphs in the response, keywords, those sorts of things. Having done that, we then identified 3 high-level patterns that seem to relate in quite symptomatic ways to different types of question structure. And this is where we can start to identify some of the implications for question design in the age of AI. So our 3 patterns that we came up with were quotation regurgitation, keyword repetition, and what we call and/or maximalism. Now, we're not going to share all the data underpinning this and all the examples, but I'll obviously walk you through some symptomatic examples of each of those 3 criteria. So the first pattern that we came up with is quotation regurgitation. Okay, so many questions in English, but it's the same in other disciplines like history or psychology, for example, often include a quotation from a prominent literary figure or from a prominent theoretical text. So we've got a long quotation here from Charlotte Bronte, for example. And obviously students are invited to respond in relation to that quotation. It's obviously natural that in student responses, in ordinary student responses, their answers will refer back to that quote. But one of the things we discovered was that AI is very heavy-handed in terms of the way in which it repeats quotations. So what we did was we coded where a quote had been reused. Where part of a quote had been reused, we coded that as 0.5. Where the entire quote had been reused, we coded that as 1. And these quotes tended to recur very heavily in the introduction in particular, and sometimes in the conclusion. So you can see here across 15 AI outputs for this particular question, every single time that some of the quote at least was reused, and actually in a third of generations, the entire quote was reused. And that becomes really obvious when that is done, when that entirety of the quotation is reused. So here we have the start of, I think it's the second generation output. So you have the long quote here, and then it says, this serves as a rich gateway into exploring the themes of identity and ownership. I mean, it's a pretty weak response. It's not really actually using the quotation as any kind of stimulus other than just to get the essay moving. But what we discovered was that this regurgitative behavior looks quite different when you have a shorter quotation versus a longer quotation. So here is our shortest quotation from our initial sample, "The stars shone through the rents of ruin," a quote from Byron. And as you can see here, this quote was reused in its entirety almost every time in the introduction and in the conclusion. Now you could say, well, okay, human writers are also quite likely to regurgitate or reuse short quotations. So it would be quite hard to judge any individual essay as being AI or human if it exhibited what we call top and tailing behavior, so having a quote at the beginning and in full at the end. But it is significant that this occurs consistently across a run of 15 prompted essays. So I think if bookending like this does occur consistently in a cohort of exam scripts, you know, that's a hallmark of potentially widespread AI use. One of the things we might conclude from this is, well, okay, if you're designing an assessment, if you're designing a question, maybe you ought to set questions with really short quotations, because that way it's much more likely that if a student does use AI and simplistically prompt the AI with the question and paste the output, that's going to leave an evidential trace, because you're going to see this repetition in full everywhere you look. Obviously, there are some complications with that. Firstly, if a quote is too short, the repetition might be a normative human behavior as well. You know, students may naturally copy and paste the quotation they've been asked to engage with and reuse that in their own human written introduction and conclusion. So it's quite hard to distinguish AI use from normal human use. So what we found is that the most effective practice, and this is only a kind of rule of thumb, we can't obviously put an absolute number on this, but in general, the most effective practice is going to be to set quotations at a length where it's still likely that an AI, if prompted naively, would regurgitate them wholesale, but where it's unlikely a human would regurgitate that quotation wholesale themselves. So that means a quote that's a little bit longer than this one, but a little bit shorter than the previous one, which wasn't so heavily regurgitated. Perhaps a quote that runs to more than one complex sentence, or maybe two complex but shorter sentences together. And at that length, we'd suggest that, you know, if a student does use AI in a very lazy way, copy and paste kind of way, that's going to become more obvious because of the AI's defaulting to this repetition, regurgitation sort of behavior. And on the flip side, you know, at least the student who's using AI a bit reflectively would have to employ a bit of manual effort to integrate quotations in a way that seems more streamlined. They would notice, hopefully for themselves, that the quote is just being reused simplistically in the introduction and conclusion. So then we have to think about how a student might at least do some manual work to edit that after the event. The second pattern that we identified across this data set was keyword repetition. So obviously a lot of questions, again, any subjects, not just ours, include keywords, usually abstract nouns, which provide the kind of conceptual focus for the answer. So in this case, the keywords that people have to engage with are identity and ownership. In English, in particular, you know, keywords are often associated with quite a contested topic. And usually you'd hope that a more advanced answer wouldn't just blindly repeat the keyword, they develop nuances and alternatives around it. So, for example, if a student in this question is invited to consider identity, you'd hope a stronger answer would narrow the terms of reference and think about what aspect of identity, maybe it's class or gender, is most significant to the novel under discussion. So they might use identity to begin with, but then they'd subsequently use subsidiary terms relating to that as they go through the essay. What we found in the AI responses was it didn't really do that at all. It defaulted to very blunt, very heavy-handed repetition of the keywords in the question. So for this particular question, across 15 generations, on average, the keyword occurred 4 times per paragraph. One or other of the keywords occurred 4 times per paragraph, or once every 23 words, which is an astonishing number when you actually think about it. But that's a number that's more or less in line with what other similar studies have also found. Most of those repetitions tended to occur as a very obvious kind of signposting gesture at the start of a paragraph. So here's the second paragraph, just symptomatically of one of our generations. So the first body paragraph had talked about Jane Eyre. The second one begins, in contrast to Jane Eyre, Jean Rhys's wide sargasso delves, there's another giveaway, delves into the colonial dimensions of identity and ownership. So again, students do use keyword repetition. They do signpost as they go through an essay, of course they do, but where it happens repeatedly, that becomes really obvious as an AI hallmark. Our third and final pattern was AI maximalism. So this is how ChatGPT interprets questions that allow, in principle, for multiple different options to be covered under an and/or rubric. So in this case, students could write on ruins and/or fragments and/or form. And what we found was that without any exception, AI-generated answers interpreted these questions as requiring an and rather than an or response. So in the case of this question, it always answered on ruins and fragments and form rather than selecting from that list. The same is true of our sample question 2 and also our sample question 4. So obviously what that did was led to answers that were quite shallow. They spread themselves really thin, and although they were decent answers in general, they weren't spectacularly good answers against the marks criteria. This one was quite hard to evaluate though, because of course there are other factors that affect how an answer is going to spread itself across the range that's allowed by the question. So for example, option 5 had no and/or options in it, or question 5 had no and/or options in it, but it did allow students to write on any text. And consequently, the AI picked that up and said, well, okay, I'm going to have to write on 6 different texts. And it led to these really short paragraphs that weren't really doing much in terms of building up an argument as a whole. Now, again, obviously what we're measuring here is AI's default use. We're not measuring real-world student usage. In the real world, you could expect a student to kind of prompt the AI and to tell it to focus on one of those topics or the other, rather than just asking it to do what the question says on the surface. Having said that, students can be quite lazy as well. Some of them do resort to zero-shot prompting and just copy and paste the question blindly. So the hope here is that it will potentially make that obvious where that is happening, or on the flip side, on the more positive side, it would at least encourage students to stop and think for themselves before they get to the AI about which of these they want to focus on more. And then hopefully in choosing which they're going to focus on, that's going to reflect some of the knowledge or understanding that they've developed in a more human way through the module. So just to bring this to a close, just for the final minute before we launch into discussion, 3 conclusions broadly that we can draw about question design. None of these are to say, that the essay is fundamentally safe in the context of AI or can be made safe in the context of AI. Despite all the problems that we identified in our read, every one of those essays would have passed at a 2-1 level. So they're not going to be kind of ways of solving the AI problem, obviously we need much more fundamental assessment rethinking as we go along. At the same time, for administrative reasons, structural reasons, resource reasons, exam-style essay questions are here to stay for a while yet. So if they are still being used, these are the three pieces of advice that we'd offer. Include medium-length quotations, 1 or 2 complex sentences where repetition is going to become very obvious if it's done by an AI tool beyond the level of an ordinary human kind of response. Number 2, frame questions around several distinct keywords. While a student might edit out quotation regurgitation because it's really obvious, where keyword repetition happens, it's embedded throughout the entire essay. So that is either going to be left in and result in a weaker response, or a student is going to have to do more manual work to correct that after the event. And finally, and/or optionality. I think this is perhaps the most important one, because that it requires even the kind of laziest student, even the most academically misconducting student, to at least think about avoiding a zero-shot prompt and instead think about where they're going to focus their response. And at a cohort level, essays that do resort to ands repeatedly, that do repeat keywords repeatedly and obviously, and that do regurgitate quotations repeatedly and obviously, that might be a symptom too that AI has been used at that more generic level.